Some stories shine so brightly that they blind us. They dazzle, they impress, they make us believe in the extraordinary. But behind that brilliance, there is often a shadow. The story of Andreas Münzer is exactly that kind of story. In the world of bodybuilding, his name is spoken with a mix of reverence and unease. They called him the man without skin. And it wasn't just a catchy nickname. His body carried so little fat that you could trace every fiber, every vein, every cut of the muscle, as if his skin were transparent. On stage, under the bright lights, he didn't even look human. He looked like an anatomy chart that had come to life, a sculpture carved out of flesh. To many, he was the very definition of perfection. To others, he was a terrifying reminder of how far obsession can go. Judges admitted openly, no one had ever looked like him. His level of definition seemed beyond human possibility, and perhaps no one will ever achieve it again. To the fans, he was mesmerizing, a blend of awe and horror. But perfection like that doesn't come for free. It has a cost, and Andreas Münzer paid the ultimate price. His story isn't just about bodybuilding. It isn't just about muscles, trophies, or magazine covers. It's about obsession. It's about what happens when discipline turns into fanaticism, when chasing a dream leaves nothing else standing. His life was a meteoric rise, fast, dazzling, unstoppable. And just like a meteor, he burned out too soon. To understand why, we need to go back to the very beginning, to a quiet Austrian countryside, where life moved at the pace of cows grazing in the fields, where nothing seemed extraordinary, and where no one could have imagined that one day this boy would become the most extreme bodybuilder of all time. Because in his youth, Andreas was not the kind of boy anyone would have picked as a future legend. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the strongest, he wasn't even particularly ambitious at first. He was quiet, reserved, a little shy, and yet, somewhere deep inside, there was something else, something that would one day take control of him completely. That something was the refusal to stop, the refusal to accept limits, the refusal to settle for ordinary. Andreas Münzer's life is more than just biography. It is a warning. It's a reminder that the human body, for all its strength, is fragile, that the pursuit of perfection can strip a man of everything, his health, his happiness, even his humanity. Today, decades after his death, when steroids and dangerous shortcuts have become common in gyms all around the world, his story feels more relevant than ever. Because Münzer's legacy isn't just about how he lived, it's about how he died, and what his death says about the sport he loved. This is not just the story of a bodybuilder, it is the story of obsession, sacrifice, and tragedy. It is the story of a man who became a legend, and paid for it with his life. To understand how Andreas Münzer became both a legend and a cautionary tale, you have to begin far from the bright lights of competition. His story starts in the Austrian countryside, a quiet world of rolling hills, dairy farms, and long, steady routines. Life there was simple. You worked the land, you cared for the animals, you lived by the rhythm of the seasons. Nothing in that landscape suggested greatness, and certainly not the kind of greatness that burns so hot it consumes itself. Andreas was born into a modest farming family. His childhood was ordinary in every way. He was a shy boy, reserved and polite, never the loudest voice in a room. Friends and neighbors remembered him as gentle, almost delicate in his manners. He wasn't a troublemaker, and he wasn't the type to chase after attention. In fact, if you had looked at him then, you would never have guessed that he would one day stand on a stage, stripped to the bone, judged by thousands for the shape of his body. As a child, Andreas loved soccer, skiing in the winter, and running around like any other boy. But he also had a side to him that seemed completely at odds with the man he would later become. He played the trumpet. Imagine that, the future man without skin, the embodiment of pain and muscle and discipline, once sat in the local band, cheeks puffed out, brass in his hands, filling the air with music. It's hard to reconcile those two images, but that's where he came from. A quiet, almost artistic boy in a rural village. The turning point came almost by accident. While training as a metalworker, Andreas often had long waits for the bus home. Hours to kill in a small town can feel endless, and he hated wasting time. One day, he wandered into a nearby gym. He wasn't looking for a new life. He just wanted to keep himself busy. But the gym didn't let him go. The weights spoke to him in a way nothing else had. At first, it was curiosity. Could he lift more than last week? Could he feel stronger? But the changes came quickly. His body responded as if it had been waiting for this moment. Muscles began to grow, his frame hardened, and with every glance in the mirror, he saw a different boy looking back. For Andreas, this was a revelation. In the gym, he discovered a world where effort had an immediate reward, where discipline had visible proof. On the farm, work never ended. In the fields, one day blurred into another. But in the gym, every rep, every drop of sweat counted. Here was something he could control, something that was entirely his. And from that moment, the shy farm boy began to fade, and the relentless athlete was born. Andreas didn't do anything halfway. If he practiced the trumpet, he practiced until he mastered the notes. If he trained until his muscles failed. And now, inside that gym, he found the pursuit that would define him. It wasn't just exercise anymore, it was transformation. And once Andreas Münzer caught that glimpse of what was possible, he knew he would never stop chasing it. The first time Andreas stepped onto a bodybuilding stage, he wasn't the legend yet. He was just a young man, nervous, curious, unsure of what awaited him under the blinding lights. The hall smelled of oil and sweat. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, and for a moment he must have wondered if he truly belonged there. But when his name was called and he walked out, something extraordinary happened. The shy farm boy vanished. In his place stood a competitor, calm and deliberate, moving with the confidence of someone who had prepared for this moment his entire life. He flexed, he posed, he held his ground, and the audience saw not hesitation, but control. Against seasoned rivals, Andreas managed to take second place. For many athletes, that would be the highlight of their early career, a prize to celebrate and then let go. But for Andreas, it was something else entirely. That silver medal wasn't an end. It was the spark of a fire. Second place proved he had potential. Second place told him, "You're close." And to him, close was never enough. That was the moment obsession took root. From then on, the gym wasn't just a place to pass the time, it became his temple. The weights weren't just tools, they were tests of his willpower. Every rep was a question, and every answer was the same: go further. Friends noticed the transformation. The quiet, reserved young man who once spent hours with his trumpet was disappearing. In his place stood someone harder, sharper, consumed by training. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He read about nutrition, memorized training philosophies, calculated every detail of his routine. He wanted to know everything, because if knowledge could give him an edge, he would seize it. Andreas's body changed rapidly. His muscles thickened, his frame filled out, his definition sharpened. But more than his body, it was his mind that shifted. He began to think like a competitor. Rest days became rare, meals became fuel, pain became a signal. Not to stop, but to push harder. At local competitions, his presence grew. People whispered about the Austrian with the sculpted physique and unshakable focus. He wasn't just another amateur chasing glory. He was different. There was a steeliness in his eyes, the look of someone who wouldn't accept limits. And while others celebrated after competitions, Andreas returned to training. Victory, loss, or second place didn't change his routine. To him, every day was another chance to get closer to perfection. That drive set him apart. Looking back, it's easy to see that second place finish not as a medal, but as a crossroads. Andreas could have treated bodybuilding as a passion, a hobby alongside a normal life. Instead, he chose the path of total devotion. He chose to give the sport not just his effort, but everything he had. And from that moment, there was no turning back. The voice inside him grew louder, more, harder, no excuses. It was the voice that would guide him to glory, and ultimately, to tragedy. Andreas Münzer didn't take long to move from promise to presence. The second place medal from his first contest wasn't a conclusion, it was ignition. Within a few short years, he wasn't just another competitor on a small stage, he was building a reputation as someone different, someone relentless. In his early 20s, Andreas made a bold move that spoke volumes about his mindset. He opened his own gym. For most young men, a gym is just a place to train. For Andreas, it became something more: a fortress, a laboratory, a shrine. Inside its walls, he sculpted not just his body, but his entire life. Every piece of equipment, every routine, every rep was part of a larger mission: to turn himself into the most defined athlete the sport had ever seen. But the bodybuilding world isn't just about discipline and iron. It's about opportunity, and opportunity often comes through the right people. For Andreas, that person was Albert Busek. Busek was a powerful figure in the European bodybuilding scene, a journalist, a publisher, and a vice president of the IFBB. He had the connections to open doors, and he saw something in Andreas that the rest of the world was only beginning to notice. Under Busek's influence, Andreas stepped onto the international stage. The rise was fast. He appeared on the covers of German magazines, then international ones. Photos of his impossible definition circulated, shocking and inspiring at the same time. In gyms across Europe, people spoke his name with both admiration and disbelief. He was no longer just Andreas from Austria. He was Münzer, the living statue, the man whose skin seemed thinner than paper. Comparisons with Arnold Schwarzenegger were inevitable. Both men came from Austria. Both emerged from small villages to take on the bodybuilding world. But their paths diverged sharply. Arnold dreamed of Hollywood, politics, global fame. Andreas wanted only one thing: the stage. No cameras, no movie sets, no distractions, just the purity of competition and the relentless pursuit of physical perfection. By now, Andreas's reputation for discipline had become legend. He didn't indulge in off-seasons the way other competitors did. While rivals allowed themselves to bulk up and rest, Andreas stayed shredded all year round. He refused to soften, refused to step back even for a month. His body was always stage ready, always on the razor's edge. It was this extremity that set him apart. Judges couldn't ignore it. Fans couldn't look away. But admiration was mixed with unease. Trainers and doctors whispered that no body could maintain this condition for long. To look like Münzer was to live at war with your own biology. To sustain it meant paying a price no one else dared to pay. Andreas didn't care. For him, the only thing that mattered was progress: sharper, drier, leaner. Each year, each contest, he had to outdo himself. He wasn't just competing with others, he was competing with his own reflection. And by the early 90s, Andreas Münzer had become a name etched into bodybuilding history. A man admired, feared, and destined to be remembered, not just for how he lived, but for how far he was willing to go. To understand Andreas Münzer, you have to understand the way he lived, not the way he looked on stage for a few fleeting minutes, but the way he endured every hour of every day. His body didn't appear by chance. It was carved out of routine, discipline, and self-denial so extreme that for most people, it sounds less like training and more like punishment. Andreas woke before sunrise. While the village outside still slept, he was already moving, already working. The day always began with cardio, long, punishing sessions on a bike or treadmill. Not the kind of cardio meant to warm up, but hours of steady grinding, sweat pouring from his body. He treated each session like a battlefield, proof to himself that he could outlast pain, that discipline was stronger than comfort. Breakfast was not a meal. It was a calculation. Eggs without yolks, dry rice, lean meat, steamed vegetables. No sauces, no flavors, nothing unnecessary. His diet was stripped bare in the same way his body was stripped of fat. Fat, in fact, was almost non-existent in his nutrition. To him, every gram of food was fuel. If it didn't build muscle or sharpen his definition, it had no place on his plate. And water, endless water. Andreas drank up to 10 liters a day, carefully balanced with magnesium to keep his body from collapsing under the strain. Where others might sip casually, Andreas measured, consumed, and controlled. Even hydration became part of the ritual. Then came the weight training. His program was notorious: a double split, meaning he trained twice a day, every day except Sunday. 6 days a week, morning and evening, he hammered every muscle group. For Andreas, the word failure didn't mean the point where your muscles give out. For him, failure was the starting line. He believed that the true growth began only once the body screamed for mercy, and he never gave it any. Training partners said watching him was unnerving. He wasn't loud, he wasn't showy. He didn't slam weights or roar for attention. He was silent, cold, and relentless. He performed each rep like a machine, without pause, without distraction. His eyes focused, his jaw tight, his movements precise. You could almost feel that he wasn't lifting against the weights, he was lifting against himself. And then he would do it again, and again, and again. Outside the gym, there was nothing. No alcohol, no nightlife, no indulgences. Family gatherings, small pleasures, even hobbies, all faded away. His world shrank into three things: train, eat, sleep. Over and over, without deviation, without compromise. He was building not just muscle, but a fortress of discipline around his life. For fans, this discipline was inspiring. For those who knew him more closely, it was frightening, because no human body can live forever in a constant state of war. Andreas Münzer was trying to prove otherwise. He was determined to show that perfection wasn't just an appearance, it could be a way of life. But perfection demands everything. And slowly, quietly, it began to take everything from him. Discipline alone didn't create Andreas Münzer. No matter how strict the diet, no matter how punishing the training, there was another element behind his almost alien physique. It was the element nobody liked to speak about openly, but everyone in the sport knew was there: drugs. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, bodybuilding had already entered an era where chemistry ruled as much as iron. Competitors whispered about it, fans speculated about it, and doctors warned about it. But behind the scenes, anabolic steroids, diuretics, and growth hormones were as much a part of preparation as barbells and dumbbells. And Andreas Münzer, the man who lived without compromise, embraced this world just as fanatically as he embraced training. At first, the cycles were modest compared to what would follow: testosterone injections, basic anabolic compounds, a few oral tablets. But the body adapts quickly, and what once produced results soon produced nothing. Where one shot was enough yesterday, two were needed today. Where a few milligrams once carved muscle, now grams were required. For Andreas, increasing the dosage wasn't a question of choice. It was survival. If he wanted to remain the man without skin, he had to keep escalating. Diuretics became his trademark weapon. They stripped every drop of water from his system, leaving him so dry, so cut, that under the stage lights, he looked unreal. Veins crawled across his body, muscles stood out as if etched in stone. But the cost was devastating. Diuretics don't only pull water from under the skin. They drain electrolytes, unbalance the heart, and put the kidneys into chaos. Every time he used them, he wasn't just risking dehydration, he was risking collapse. Then came growth hormone, hailed as the miracle of modern bodybuilding. It made muscles fuller, skin thinner, definition sharper. But growth hormone doesn't discriminate. It enlarges organs, thickens tissues, stretches the body in unnatural ways. Andreas used it in doses that would terrify a doctor. He layered it with insulin to drive nutrients into his muscles, creating a cocktail designed to force the body into extremes it was never meant to reach. While other competitors allowed themselves to relax in the off-season, Andreas refused. Most bodybuilders put on weight in between shows, softening a little, letting the body rest before cutting back down. Not him. Münzer stayed shredded year-round, maintaining the impossible as his baseline. His body fat hovered at levels so low they were considered medically dangerous, levels no one else dared to live at permanently. The result was a physique that judges couldn't look away from. His nickname, the man without skin, became both awe and warning. His back alone was so lean that varicose veins were visible, something no one had ever seen on a bodybuilding stage. For some, it was artistry. For others, it was grotesque. But for Andreas, it was the only acceptable standard. And yet, behind every vein, behind every striation, there was a darker truth. He wasn't just sculpting muscle, he was poisoning himself piece by piece. Each pill, each injection, each vial was another step closer to the point of no return. Andreas Münzer had achieved the impossible, but in doing so, he had built a cage for himself, one made not of steel, but of discipline and chemicals. A cage with no door. A cage he would never escape. Behind the sculpted muscles and the cold discipline, Andreas Münzer was still a man. And like any man, he searched for connection, for someone who could understand the life he had chosen. In the world of bodybuilding, where every meal is measured and every hour scheduled, true relationships are rare. But Andreas found one. Her name was Elizabeth Schwartz. Elizabeth wasn't just a partner, she was a competitor in her own right. A bodybuilder herself, she knew the endless grind of cardio, the tasteless meals, the obsession with symmetry and size. Their relationship wasn't built on candlelight dinners or spontaneous getaways. It was built on gym sessions, shared discipline, and the unspoken understanding that love in their world could never come before the sport. And yet, there was tenderness in their bond. Those who saw them together recalled how Andreas, so hard and machine-like in the gym, softened around her. He wasn't loud or overly affectionate, but his care showed in small gestures. A smile, a hand on her shoulder, quiet words of encouragement. It was, in its own way, a romance carved out of the harshest conditions. Andreas made Elizabeth a promise. They would marry, he said, but only when she won a world title. It was a strange condition, almost symbolic of how he saw life. Even love had to be measured by victory. Success was the gate through which everything else had to pass. And tragically, that victory did come for her, but only after Andreas was gone. This vow tells you everything about him. To Andreas, personal life and professional life weren't separate. Everything was tied to the sport. Achievements defined milestones, and even intimacy was filtered through ambition. He didn't do this out of cruelty. It was simply the way he was wired. His world was bodybuilding, and everything else had to fit inside it. But that meant sacrifices. His family saw less and less of him. Social life disappeared. Holidays, birthdays, casual pleasures, they barely existed. To love Andreas was to love a man who was never truly present. He lived inside routines, inside the gym, inside his own relentless drive. Friends often described him in contradictions. On one hand, he was polite, respectful, almost shy in everyday life. On the other, he was merciless with himself in training, pushing past limits that others wouldn't even approach. That contrast defined him. The gentle man who, when it came to his body, became ruthless. For Elizabeth, and for anyone close to him, it meant living in the shadow of his obsession. She stood by him, shared the grind, supported his pursuit, but no one could protect him from himself. His discipline was too strong, his ambition too unyielding. And in the end, that is the deepest tragedy of his story. Andreas Münzer sacrificed not just his health, but his humanity. He gave up the simple joys of love, family, and life outside the gym. He believed it was worth it, that one day the perfection he achieved would make sense of all the loss. But perfection, as Andreas would prove, demands more than love can give. And once it takes hold, it rarely lets go. By the mid-1990s, Andreas Münzer had become a name spoken with a mix of awe and fear in the bodybuilding world. Fans expected to see the impossible every time he stepped on stage. Judges demanded that he appear sharper, drier, more defined than the last time. And Andreas, driven by his own relentless standards, refused to give them anything less. But his body was already sending warnings he would not hear. In 1996, he arrived at the Arnold Classic, one of the most prestigious bodybuilding shows in the world. For Andreas, this was not just another competition. It was the arena where reputations were solidified, where legends were made. He took the stage with the same terrifying conditioning that had earned him his nickname. Veins crawling across his muscles, a physique that looked more sculpture than flesh. Yet this time, the judges placed him only 6th. To most athletes, 6th at the Arnold Classic would be a triumph. To Andreas, it was humiliation. He had not trained to be among the best. He had trained to be untouchable. Anything less than perfection was failure in his eyes. And failure was something he had never allowed himself to accept. But the truth was clear to those who looked closer. His eyes, once focused and burning, now carried exhaustion. His movements, while still powerful, seemed slower. The man who lived permanently in competition shape was beginning to crack. Friends and fellow competitors noticed. They whispered that his body couldn't keep up with the punishment, that the endless cycles of chemicals and dehydration had pushed him too far. Andreas ignored them. He always ignored them. To him, stopping was worse than death. After Arnold Classic, he immediately traveled to San Jose for another professional show. Again, he placed outside the top. Again, he pushed his body harder to correct what he saw as weakness. This was Andreas Münzer's trap. He could not step back, even for a moment. In bodybuilding, most athletes allowed themselves to rest between competitions, to recover before the next storm. For Andreas, there was no such thing as rest. The show never ended. Every day was preparation for the stage, every week a continuation of the same brutal cycle. To achieve that look, he restricted himself in ways that bordered on suicidal. Water intake cut to half a liter a day before shows. Calories slashed until his body ran on fumes. Diuretics stacked on top of diuretics, squeezing the last drops of fluid from his body. His system was a house of cards, trembling with every adjustment. Close friends tried to intervene. They begged him to slow down, to consider his health, to see a doctor. Andreas brushed it aside with his usual calm. "I can't stop now," he told them. "I can't let myself down." On stage, he still looked like the embodiment of discipline, but behind the curtain, he was a man at war with himself, and losing. The competitions that year weren't just contests. They were the final battles of a war his body could no longer fight, and in that war, there would be only one outcome. March 1996. The relentless machine that was Andreas Münzer finally began to break down. It didn't happen on stage, and it didn't happen in the gym. It happened quietly, violently, in the most human way possible, with pain. He woke with an agony in his stomach that refused to fade. For years, Andreas had learned to ignore pain. He had trained himself to push past it, to silence it, to make it fuel rather than weakness. But this was different. This wasn't muscle ache or exhaustion. This was sharp, crippling, unrelenting. Even Münzer, who had endured more punishment than most men could imagine, couldn't ignore it. Friends rushed him to the hospital. There, doctors faced a body unlike anything they had ever seen. Outwardly, Andreas looked like a masterpiece. Every muscle defined, every vein visible, the picture of health. But inside, he was collapsing. Internal bleeding had begun. His organs were failing. His blood chemistry was chaos. They tried to save him, but it was like trying to hold back an avalanche. His liver, swollen and riddled with tumors, had given up. His kidneys were shutting down. His heart, enlarged to nearly twice its normal size, fought erratically to keep him alive. His system was too poisoned, too fragile. Within days, Andreas Münzer was gone. He was just 31 years old. But the true horror emerged in the autopsy. The report read, less like medicine and more like a nightmare. His liver weighed almost 3 kilograms, nearly a kilo heavier than normal, and was covered in tumors the size of ping pong balls. Half of the organ had turned into a stiff, plastic-like mass. His kidneys were enlarged and swollen, waterlogged from years of abuse. His lungs were scarred, his gallbladder blocked, his reproductive organs shrunken to the point of atrophy. His heart weighed 639 grams, more than double the average for a man his size. His blood revealed the rest of the story. Traces of more than 20 substances coursed through his system: anabolic steroids, diuretics, stimulants, hormones. The very cocktail that had built his legend had also destroyed him. One doctor described his insides as more poisonous than a viper's venom. The official cause of death was recorded as multiple organ failure. But those words don't capture the reality. His body had been at war with itself for years, and in March 1996, the war was lost. At his funeral, a wreath arrived from Arnold Schwarzenegger. It bore a simple message: a final greeting to a friend. The irony was bitter. Andreas had spent his career chasing the Austrian icon, determined to surpass him in glory. In the end, the only connection between them was a farewell at his grave. The bodybuilding world was shaken, though not for long. For a brief moment, Andreas Münzer's death was front-page news, the terrifying example of what happens when obsession and chemistry go too far. Doctors warned, journalists condemned, fans grieved. But soon enough, the lights turned back on, the competitions resumed, and the cycle continued. Andreas Münzer was dead, but his body, both in life and in death, remained a message carved in flesh. This is what perfection costs. The story of Andreas Münzer does not end with his death. In many ways, that was only the beginning of his legacy. To this day, his name lingers in gyms, in whispered conversations about steroids, in debates over how far is too far in the pursuit of perfection. His life was extraordinary, but it was also a warning. They called him the man without skin. On stage, that name was awe-inspiring. It meant he was the most defined bodybuilder in history, a man whose physique seemed carved under a microscope. But after his death, the nickname took on a different meaning. He was also a man without protection, without limits, stripped down until there was nothing left to shield him from the consequences of his choices. His death in 1996 sent a shockwave through bodybuilding. Newspapers published grisly details of his autopsy. Experts described his organs as toxic, his body as destroyed by the very substances that made him famous. For a moment, it seemed like the sport might take a step back, might learn from the tragedy. But the truth is, bodybuilding didn't change. The competitions continued, the standards grew harsher, and the substances became more advanced. Münzer had shown the world the price of perfection, and yet the world still wanted more. That is the paradox of his legacy. On one hand, he is remembered with admiration. Even those who criticize the culture of drugs admit that Andreas's dedication was unmatched. He never cut corners in effort. He lived with a discipline so absolute that it frightened those who knew him. In the gym, he was an example of total commitment. Outside of it, he was remembered as kind, polite, even shy. People who trained with him recalled his humility, his willingness to help others. He was not arrogant, not cruel, not the stereotype of the egotistical competitor. He was simply a man consumed by his own pursuit. On the other hand, his story is one of caution. He proved what the human body could look like when pushed to its absolute extreme, and he proved that chasing that extreme will eventually break the body beyond repair. For professionals, his death became a warning whispered backstage. For amateurs, it became a ghost story in locker rooms. Don't go too far. Don't become another Münzer. But perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy is that, for many, the warning went unheeded. Today, steroids and dangerous chemical shortcuts are not just for professionals. They're in local gyms, in back rooms, sold to teenagers who dream of looking like their idols. In that sense, Andreas's story is more relevant than ever, a reminder that behind every perfect physique, there may be a cost no one sees. Andreas Münzer's life was like a meteor, burning brilliantly, crossing the sky so brightly that no one could ignore it. But meteors don't last. They fall, they shatter, they disappear. He gave everything he had for a vision of perfection, and in the end, it consumed him. So, if anyone ever asks whether perfection is worth dying for, the answer is already written. It's written in the story of a man from the Austrian countryside who became a legend and a tragedy. The answer is his name, Andreas Münzer.